Hi, it's Drake. I decided I'd start a new, I guess I'd call it a series, where I will choose a composer, classical composer that I really enjoy, and I'll shoot for, 20, 30 minute long video, just talking about their life, talking about the works I like, and talking about their influences, maybe people who knew them, maybe even the time period that they lived. And the first one I decided on, for no reason in particular, but he's been one of my favorites for a really long time. Maurice Ravel is going to be the first composer that I talk about. And this is a little more complex than my other videos I make, so I have some notes. So I'll begin by talking about his biography generally, and then as I get into it, I'm sure it'll get less chronological. But so he was born in 1875, which is pretty close to the time that Proust was born in 1871, and it's the beginning of the modern era, it seems to me. His mother was from the Basque region of Spain and France. It's really kind of in a middle section where I think the Basque region is mostly known for being in Spain, but there is also a French portion along the mountains there. And he was actually born in the Basque region. His father was a French Swiss from the border around there. And it seems to me each of his parents had quite a big influence on him. You can tell from his music that the Basque region he was born in and his mother really influenced that. And his father seems to be like, he was an engineer. He invented some products that were used quite widely. And that sort of, maybe you could call it a scientific mindset, seems to have affected his life too, where he wasn't really inclined to follow mass movements or rumors or subjective judgments as much, which I'll get into later. But he was into music at an early age, and he did study music quite early also. As early as when he was 12. He started piano when he was very young, but then he started getting into composing. And when he joined the Paris Conservatoire, he won awards for piano, but he was most interested in composing, and that showed because while he did win awards early on with piano, he was gradually passed by some of his more excellent classmates, I would say. Excellent in the literal term. But oddly enough, at the time, he did not follow the orthodoxy of the classical music in France at the time. He, throughout his life, would enter several competitions for composing, and even at the end of his where he would submit, he caused a scandal by how good his music was compared to how high he made it in the competition. And I just think it's so interesting how these sort of artists at the time are derided by critics, and then they keep doing what they were doing, and then eventually the critics roll around and end up praising them. And it was interesting, Ravel had a quote here where he said, like in the 1920s, Ravel was basically, after Debussy died, he was the most famous French composer, or at least the most well-regarded. And once the critics started praising him because he was famous, he said, well, their praise is as worthless as their derision when I was younger. And I really like that sort of mindset, because I don't have much respect for critics unless they can actually, make the music as well as the person they're critiquing, or any artistic aspect. But as far as his early works in the late 1800s, the like 1890s, there aren't many that I really like listening to. The two exceptions, one set for piano he did. It's a really short piece called the Serenade Grotesque. He wrote in the early 1890s. I think it's interesting. It's not like a great work or anything, but it has interesting rhythms. It reminds me of some of Stravinsky's pieces, his like interesting rhythms that he does. In the beginning of the Rite of Spring, it has those. I don't know how to say it, but well, if you know the Rite of Spring, you'll know the offbeats, and it's interesting. Also, Prokofiev's piano pieces or Rachmaninoff's, they generally have some interesting rhythms, like in a toccata or something like that. And the only other one that I can think of that was done in the 1890s was his Pavane for a Dead Princess, which he originally wrote for the piano and then later orchestrated, which is also a common theme among his works, where he would write something for the piano and then later orchestrate it. And throughout his life, he was known for his exceptional skill in orchestration. But he also was known for not writing that many works in general. I think after World War One, which he fought in, served in, I guess, he only published one work a year, which compared to some of his contemporaries was significantly less than they published. But one notable exception is Rachmaninoff, who I think was quality over quantity, along with Ravel. But I guess I'll go on to, he was a part of this group known as Les Apaches. I guess that's how you say it in French, the Apaches, which literally translated to the Apaches, the American tribe. But in French it had the connotation of being like the English, the hooligans. And it had a pretty famous list of people. Of course, Ravel was part of it. Manuel de Falla, the Spanish composer. Leon Paul Fargue. It had Florent Schmitt, who was a French composer who wrote good music, but he basically supported the Nazis. So that was that for his artistic career. And then also notably, it had Igor Stravinsky, who I'll talk about later in the context of Ravel. But one interesting thing I read about Leon Paul Fargue, he hasn't been translated into English really at all yet, but Walter Benjamin met him in 1930, and I've always past couple months been interested in Walter Benjamin, but Walter Benjamin called him the greatest living poet in France, so that makes me really interested in reading him. He was also well regarded by Rilke and Joyce, but this isn't about Paul Fargue, this video, but I want to read one section of his Wikipedia page. A guy named Leon Pierre Quint, in November 1929, he wrote, "Fargue is one of those people who write as they speak. He constantly utters works that remain unwritten, perhaps from indolence, perhaps from contempt for writing. An endless sequence of unforced flashes of wit and puns. This was the only way he was capable of speaking. He has a childlike love of Paris, with its godforsaken little cafes, its bars, its streets, and its nightlife that never ends. He must be in robust health and have a highly resilient character. During the days he works as an industrialist, and at night he always was on the move. He is constantly seen with elegant women, Americans. He is close to 50 years of age, yet leads the life of a gigolo by night, hypnotizing everyone he meets with the charm of his speech." And he seems like such an interesting character. And there is an interesting book written and translated in English, called The Last of the Bohemians, and it's about that time period roughly, from the 20s to the 40s when Fargue died. But continuing on, shortly after that time period, he wrote a well-known piece of his string quartet, which, at least among classical listeners, may be one of his famous pieces, although he has several. It was written in 1902 to 1903, and if you're familiar with Debussy, and you've heard Debussy's string quartet, there are some pretty high resemblances. They're all in good taste, I would say. There's no copying or anything, whatever that would mean, but there are notable similarities, especially the one that I like the most, apart from all the harmonic similarities or maybe melodic similarities, is the pizzicato movement. I've always loved it so much, and the classical station around here in Dallas-Fort Worth, the North Texas Classical Station, which somewhat ruined the movement for me. I wouldn't say ruined, that's a little strong, but they used that pizzicato section as part of their ad, and it's just, I hate that. I've always hated when people use classical music in ads, and that's the only time they know classical music from. It's always annoyed me very much. But anyway, that's an aside that doesn't really matter. Shortly, like in the meantime that he had written this string quartet, he had been applying for the Prix de Roman, which was the most valuable competition for a young composer in France at the time, and there had been winners. Debussy won it. I can't remember if Fauré won it, but he later became the head of the prize committee in the Conservatoire. But I should make an aside that Fauré was one of Ravel's earliest supporters and teachers. Ravel, throughout his early life, had a lot of trouble with the academics at the time and the established orthodoxy of the music. And Fauré was one of the notable differences in that vein, where Fauré realized that Ravel had to learn how he had to learn and gave him that freedom. And I had an interesting quote here later in his life that Fauré was overjoyed with the success that Ravel found in the 1920s and said it was the rapid success after he had gone through his struggles was a source of joy and pride for the old professor. And I love that, but I really think it's meaningful that Fauré helped him out in the beginning, and Ravel had so much trouble with the establishment. He actually did cause quite a scandal when he kept applying his music to the Prix de Roman, and I think he won second place once, but then all the other times he didn't place in any ranking. And the very last time that happened, he caused a scandal because one of the people on the judgment board didn't vote for Ravel's music, but among the finalists were several of his students. So that was thought to be absurd. Everyone realized the absurdity of it, and although Ravel didn't win, he became more famous for not winning than maybe if he had won. And he was friends with a wealthy couple at the time, and they took him out for I think it was a 5-week vacation. That was his first travel abroad on a ship. Let me see really quick if I missed any pieces. I just have a list of his works here. Oh yeah, just after he did his string quartet, he published the Miroir for piano, which is one of my favorite pieces of his. It has, looks like 5 piano movements. And my 2 favorite, I really like the Un Barque sur l'Ocean and Alborada del Gracioso. You'll have to pardon my French pronunciation throughout this whole video. Those are the 3rd and 4th movements of it, but really it's all great. And he later orchestrated those 2 that I mentioned, so maybe he liked those the best, I don't know. But La Veille des Cloches was really good. Oiseau Triste is really good. Pretty much the whole thing. I think it's only about like 28 minutes, so if you get a chance, if you haven't listened to it yet, it's worth listening to completely. Let's see. Also around that time, just slightly after, looks like 1907, he published a Rhapsody Espanol, which is not the first sign of his influence of the Basque region of Spain, but because he had written a piece earlier, I think 1899, for piano, habanera, but this is really the first like major thing that he wrote showing his influence. And I've always loved personally any composer who had some influence in Spanish music, like Pablo de Sarasate was one of my favorites when I first got into classical music. I like Rimsky-Korsakov. His, I think it was also called Rhapsody Espanol, actually. But I really like all Spanish composers, more or less, at least all the famous ones. Manuel de Falla was one. And just shortly after he did this Rhapsody Espanol, he published Gaspar de la Nuit, which is after a collection of poems, prose poems by Aloysius Bertrand. And this is also one of his really famous works. It's known for its difficulty, at least some of the movements, but it's not really one of those show-off pieces, one of those virtuoso show-off pieces that maybe Paganini or Franz Liszt are known for. It really focuses on the melody and the atmosphere of it more than, oh wow, that's so impressive. And that's another thing I read about Ravel, where he had a quote. This is a good time to talk about his interest in literary influences, because he did quite a few or several cycles of art songs, and I really appreciate that he had such an interest in the literature of the time. He also had an interest, as many other Frenchmen did, in Edgar Allan Poe, and there was a quote by Poe that great art is equal parts of intellect and emotion. And I really do feel that Ravel took that to heart, if not practicing it before he read about it, because his music, especially being based after great works of literature, you can tell, along with his slower production of his works, where he maybe only got to 1 a year or something, that he really gave it some extreme thought. He didn't just, write these and, oh, I need some money, throw them out there. But he gave it some thought, and in my view also, personally, his music is some of the most beautiful music I've ever heard in my life. So he definitely did not neglect the emotional part of it. But this period he was pumping out masterpieces. Right after this, just a couple years later, he first did his Daphnis et Chloe, the ballet, and I don't think I've ever watched the ballet itself, but the incidental music that he published later, the Suite 1 and 2, I love those so much. And there's a really good recording on YouTube, which I'll put in the description, by Charles Dutoit. That's it's a very good interpretation of this music. And just after that, actually, the 1 year later, after he had finished Daphnis et Chloe, that was when Igor Stravinsky had his premiere for The Rite of Spring, which, as I'm sure everyone knows, that caused a huge disturbance and people walked out. It caused a whole scene. And I thought it was interesting that Stravinsky said during the dress rehearsals, and I think during the premiere, that Ravel was present, and Stravinsky said that Ravel was the only person who understood it, like after first hearing it. And I can see how that would be the case, because Ravel throughout his life had trouble with the establishment of music, breaking tradition, but also keeping that tradition in mind while creating new works, which Stravinsky also dealt with, creating something so completely new at the time. And also going back to his Les Apachés connection, Ravel thought that their theme music should be Borodin's first melody from his Second Symphony, which is kind of like this primitive sounding that you'd imagine from Les Apachés, the title, the Apaches, which, as you know, The Rite of Spring is sort of like this primitive aspect. But that symphony, if you've ever listened to it, it goes like dun 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 dun. Dun, 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 dun. And I think, long story short, I think Ravel could understand everything that Stravinsky did in The Rite of Spring. The orchestration brilliance, the interest in the primitive, his break with tradition in the music, as far as the unorthodox maybe rhythms and orchestration, how the oboe is used and everything. And along with that Borodin connection, just after The Rite of Spring came out, or maybe during, he published a short piano suite called À la manière de Borodin and Chabrier. And Borodin obviously was a pretty big influence for Ravel, and Chabrier, I read, was I've listened to some of his music. He is really well known for his España composition, which was quoted by Mahler to be one of the foundations of modern music. So I think it's interesting that Ravel had such precise sensibilities for who would be the next stepping stone for modern music. He himself was one. And throughout this time, he had been doing song cycles. One just around the same time is 3 poems by Stéphane Mallarmé. And this is about the time that World War I started, around 1914, and although he was 40 years old at the time, he tried to join. He was known for his small stature, so he tried to join the Air Force, because generally they have smaller folks to fit in the planes. He was declined from joining the Air Force partly because of his age, and partly because of a heart complaint that he had. But he eventually he was allowed to join. He was a lorry driver, a truck driver, and during this time, I suppose in his downtime, he was writing Le Tombeau de Couperin, which is a set of pieces that was based on I don't know much about the composer Couperin, honestly, but he was either a classical composer or a Baroque composer who, had written in that older style. And Ravel kind of took that older style of his and made it his own in a way. Taking influence, putting it through Ravel's instrumentation and feeling and making it new. But that was also orchestrated a couple years later. He first wrote it for piano and then orchestrated. I really like both versions, but I prefer the orchestrated version. I love Ravel's orchestration, how he makes everything sound like... I always get this feeling from his orchestrations that it's like throaty or deep, has a really sincere depth to it, always. And let's see. Also around that time, I read, during the time of World War One and maybe a little after, there was this agreement among some prominent French musicians, Camille Saint-Saëns being one of the really well-known at the time. They had a ban of German contemporary music, which I think is so weird that, those intelligent guys would be, that nationalistic and short-sighted, I guess you could say. But I was glad to find out that Ravel completely disagreed with that and disdained it, and he spoke out in print saying that more or less it's completely short-sighted to ignore our German artistic influences, and if we just stay partitioned in our French influences, it'll become a series of banal formulaic pieces that no one will want to listen to. And after Ravel had spoken out against this ban, they banned his music from being played in this society. And I just think it's like, what in the world? They definitely were embarrassed at that decision. But gradually, as World War II ended and Ravel kept pretty steady on his output, although it was, as I mentioned earlier, only about one piece a year after World War II ended. I think the war really took a lot out of him. Similarly, at the time, you could look at Rilke, who experienced the war and after went through what you could call writer's block, but really it was a deep affectation of the war. But I think really maybe the next thing I'll talk about, let's see, when did... trying to see here when... well, one of his other famous pieces I guess I'll mention is La Valse, which was, I think, commissioned by Sergei Diaghilev. I can never remember how to say his last name, but he was a famous Russian commissioner, I guess you could say. He commissioned a lot of really famous works, and he was also I think the director of the Ballet Russe, which was a famous ballet at the time. But La Valse is a pretty well-known piece, and it's really good. Ravel really had an appreciation for those dances, like La Valse. I think also the Tombeau de Couperin. It has a rigadoon, minuet, a toccata, and also his Spanish Basque influence. Of course, he heard all the folk dances of that area, and I completely love it all. I love it all. But also around that time, he did a piece, a rhapsody for violin and piano. He also did it for orchestra called Tzigane, which is the French name for gypsy. I think in German it's Zigeuner, but um, that's also one of my favorite pieces. There's a very good recording of it, a video actually by Midori on YouTube, which incidentally that concert that she did, I think it was at Carnegie Hall, is one of the best overall concerts I've ever seen in my life. It also has, I think, some pieces by Sarasate, and it has Ernst, The Last Rose of Summer. It's an extremely good concert. I'll link it also below. And just around that time, I think it was in the 1920s, the mid 1920s, and I don't know if this was after or before Ravel went to America, but he wrote his second sonata for violin and piano. The first movement is just called Allegretto, which is extremely good in itself, but the second movement, which I thought was very interesting, and I was actually into Ravel before I was into blues music, but it's called Blues, the second movement is, and he was so influenced by the jazz and blues, I guess, the Negro music at the time, as far as like the singing. That's the way they referred to it at the time, Negro. That second movement is awesome. It has like a swing to it, like maybe you think of it as like also the ragtime influence, but that second sonata of his. For a long time, I was really into violin music, and that was one of my favorites. That's Tzigane and his second sonata, which were published, roughly at the same time. There's also an interesting thing I read that in 1928 he went on an American concert tour where he was the conductor, I think, in 25 concerts, and what he requested to do on that tour, he requested $10,000 and a constant supply of Gauloise, the cigarettes, which I thought was hilarious. But in one concert in New York, Serge Koussevitzky, who was another famous, Russian American composer, conductor, like similar to Rachmaninoff, I would say, as far as the popularity and everything. He conducted an all Ravel concert in New York, and Ravel was, I guess you could say, taken aback, if you want to use that phrase, by the audience as the composer, walked in and sat down. The whole audience stood up and gave him applause, standing ovation. And Ravel doesn't happen in Paris. And I just love that so much. But around the same time, Ravel had he orchestrated the Pictures at an Exhibition. That's a famous piano work by Modest Mussorgsky, and I think that's pretty known for being like a really good example of his orchestration, and I love that piece. I like Mussorgsky's version. Of course, he did the melodies and everything, but I'd prefer to listen to Ravel's if I was given the choice. His orchestration of it. And let's see. A little after Ravel published those two well-known pieces, he published Rev, which is a song with piano after Leon Paul Fargue. That was in 1927. That shows his literary influence. And then in quick succession, well, relatively quick, once a year, as I said before, but he published Bolero, which was commissioned by, I think, a New York ballet group that could not get the license for, I think it was Albanese, his Iberia suite, or the Iberia, ballet music. But so Ravel wrote Bolero, which it has kind of like a sort of a reputation in music as being like it's really weird because a lot of people look down on it as being repetitive and uninspired. And Ravel is quoted as saying, "I've published only one masterpiece, and it's unfortunate it had no music in it," referring to Bolero. I paraphrase that quote, but I've actually heard that live. I went to a student recording, not a recording, but a student concert in University of Arlington, and it was interesting to hear live. But I didn't. It's not my favorite piece of Ravel. But the year after he published, which was commissioned by Paul Wittgenstein, who lost his right arm in World War I, and he was pretty well known for commissioning works for left hand, for piano, and he commissioned one from Ravel for the Piano Concerto in D for the left hand, and he disliked it in the beginning. He was not overly fond of the piece, but he gradually, after playing it over and over, he gradually became much more fond of the piece. And the next year, Ravel had been working on another piano concerto in G, which has a very good recording by Marta Argerich, who's a famous, I think she's Argentinian pianist. And that second movement of that piece has to be one of the most calming movements or pieces of music ever written completely. It is, and of course the whole thing is amazing, but the second movement especially, like, if you could listen to one thing that I recommended out of any of this video, I recommend the second movement of that piece because it is just so beautiful. And tragically, that year, I think in October, he was hit by a taxi in, I believe, Paris. And while they didn't think that it affected him very much at the time, he didn't seem to have any immediate detriments. He was affected, at least. It may have exacerbated an underlying problem that had already existed. And I think there was a medical article in 1988 published about the possible neurological implications of that wreck, because after that he had been commissioned to write some music for a movie, I believe, about Don Quixote, but he couldn't meet the schedule and it was eventually finished by someone else. But he only wrote a song cycle called Don Quixote a Dulcinea, the Don Quixote and Dulcinea del Toboso. And then he never wrote any music after that, and he lived for another 5 years, and he died in pain, and it was a horrible way to go for him. But yeah, I think as like a sort of a summing up, I suppose, of my enjoyment of Ravel, he is easily one of my favorite composers, and I just love all the connections that he made between his upbringing in the Basque region of France, his complete confidence in his own ability to see the greatness in his music and also the flaws, where he didn't have to pay attention to critics. I love his, in general, sense of style, musically and personally. There's this funny picture of him where he has he has a thick beard and he has a mustache with the twirls at the end. I think when he was young he had that, but then he was always clean shaven, and he also somewhat, I guess, notoriously didn't have any romantic relationships, which I think is interesting because he obviously would be a fairly interesting person. But yeah, he's just one of my favorite composers. I recommend listening to all of his works if you get a chance. I do plan on doing some more of these videos because classical music is one of my obsessions. I would say I love classical music even more than reading. If I had to choose between the two, which that would be a horrible choice, but I would choose classical music as far as listening. If I could either read books or only listen to classical music, one or the other, I would choose classical music, which may be surprising to some people, but I think a list of other composers I could do in this manner if anyone's interested. I'm not sure if this overlaps with my book audience, but I could do Tchaikovsky, Sibelius, Scriabin, Rachmaninoff, Chopin, Dvorak, Sarasate. I could do Ernst, the violinist. Maybe a couple others, but if anyone's interested in seeing another video like this, let me know, because I love classical music and I could talk about it forever. But yeah, thanks for listening. Death is a gang boss.